Ava was a 12-year-old girl living in a small, quiet suburban town with her single mother, who worked tirelessly to provide for them. Her mother, overwhelmed with the demands of work, wasn't always present to keep an eye on Ava. This left Ava to navigate the world mostly on her own. Being an only child, she felt an aching loneliness. She had friends at school, but as time passed, she grew distant from them. Her mother's long hours and absence only deepened her isolation, making Ava yearn for attention and affection she wasn't receiving at home. Then came James. He had just moved into the neighborhood, and at first, he appeared to be the perfect neighbor. Charismatic, well-spoken, and seemingly caring, James quickly made friends with the people around him. He was someone who could fit in anywhere, always the life of the party, always approachable. To the community, he was just another friendly adult, a man who wanted to make a fresh start in a new town. But his charm hid a darker side, one that few could have imagined. James started spending time with Ava, at first offering her company in small gestures of kindness. He would buy her candy, take her to the local park, and listen to her when she spoke of her troubles at school and her feelings of loneliness. Ava, craving attention and desperate for someone who cared, welcomed the affection. At first, it felt innocent. He was an adult, but his gestures were harmless, or so she thought. To her, James was an escape from the growing tension and neglect she felt at home. Her mother was so preoccupied with work that she had no idea her daughter was spending time with someone like James. As the weeks passed, their bond grew stronger. James began showering Ava with more attention, complimenting her, giving her gifts, and even offering her small amounts of money. His actions seemed innocent on the surface, but something wasn't right. Ava, still a child, didn't know how to recognize the danger that was slowly creeping into her life. James was skilled at manipulating her, making her feel special and important. He made her believe that he was the only one who truly understood her, that their connection was something rare and meaningful. It was only when he started giving her more personal attention, brushing against her arm, making comments about her appearance, that Ava began to feel uneasy. But she was confused. She didn't know how to interpret the things he said or the way he looked at her. He made her feel both cherished and confused, and she didn't know who to turn to for answers. She couldn't talk to her mother. After all, her mother barely had time to talk to her, let alone address the growing discomfort Ava felt. James was methodical in his approach, always watching Ava's responses, always gauging how much he could push. Each time he crossed a boundary, Ava felt a sense of unease, but it was fleeting. She didn't know how to set boundaries with someone who was so much older, so experienced in manipulating emotions.
He carefully isolated her from her friends, ensuring she spent more time with him, feeding her insecurity and need for attention. Little did Ava know, this was the beginning of a dangerous relationship that would ultimately lead to her complete
dependence on him. Ava's trust in James grew, and she soon found herself turning to him for advice about everything, from school struggles to her increasing feelings of alienation. She had no idea that what she thought was a supportive friendship was, in reality, the start of a much darker, more dangerous connection. James's manipulation was subtle, but it was powerful. Ava was sinking deeper into his control, unaware of how much danger she was in. As the days went by, Ava's relationship with James became more intense and secretive. She started to spend more time with him, sneaking out when her mother wasn't around, telling her she was going to hang out with friends. But in reality, she was meeting James often in the shadows of the neighborhood, away from prying eyes. The relationship, which once seemed harmless, had now crossed a line, and Ava, despite her growing unease, found herself unable to pull away. James continued to shower her with gifts, things her mother couldn't afford to buy, things that made Ava feel special, things that made her feel like she mattered. He brought her jewelry, designer clothes, and even allowed her to drive his car, which only increased her sense of being valued and important. His attention, which had once felt so innocent, was now carefully calculated. Every time Ava hesitated or felt unsure, James would reassure her, telling her that no one would understand her the way he did. He made her feel as though their connection was something only the two of them could understand, and that no one else would ever care for her in the same way. But as the weeks passed, the tension between them began to shift. What once felt like innocent companionship began to feel more possessive and controlling. James began to push boundaries. At first it was subtle, small touches, lingering glances, comments about her physical appearance. Ava, still naive and struggling with her own confusion about their relationship, didn't know how to react. She didn't want to hurt James's feelings or lose the affection he had so freely given her. Her insecurity about being ignored by her mother had led her to crave this kind of attention, even though deep down she felt uncomfortable. It wasn't until one evening when James kissed her for the first time that Ava truly understood how dangerous this situation had become. She froze, unsure of what to do, her body tense with confusion. James reassured her, telling her that it was just a part of their bond, something that made them even closer. But to Ava, the kiss felt wrong. It felt like a betrayal of the innocence she had once felt. But the way James looked at her, with so much intensity and desire, made her question her feelings. She didn't know how to set boundaries, and she certainly didn't know how to say no to someone who made her feel so important. James's manipulation grew stronger as he continued to isolate her from others. He fed her insecurities, telling her that no one understood her like he did, and that anyone who criticized their relationship was just jealous. Ava, now fully dependent on James, stopped reaching out to her friends. She started to distance herself from anyone who might question what was happening. Even at school, she became withdrawn, her grades slipping as she focused more on meeting James's needs than anything else. The emotional control James had over Ava was becoming more evident, but she couldn't see it. She had come to rely on him for everything: attention, validation, and a sense of belonging. He made her believe that their relationship was special, that it was something no one else could ever understand. This twisted sense of closeness made Ava feel trapped in a cycle of dependency, and every time she tried to step away, James would reel her back in with promises of affection, gifts, and reassurance. In the midst of all this, Ava found herself changing. Her behavior became erratic. She was no longer the carefree girl she once was. She became anxious, paranoid, and secretive. Yet, no matter how many warning signs she ignored, she still didn't feel strong enough to break free. James had ensnared her in a web of emotional manipulation, and she didn't know how to escape. The bond between them, though twisted and unhealthy, had become her reality. And as time passed, she started to believe that maybe this was the way relationships were supposed to be. She was too young to understand the full weight of what was happening, but the sense of power James held over her only grew. And soon, it would become far too late to change anything. As the relationship between Ava and James grew darker, the weight of their secret began to take a toll on Ava's mental and emotional well-being. Her once carefree days were now filled with anxiety, and her attempts to escape the growing pressure only led her deeper into James's control. She had stopped seeing her friends, stopped attending social events, and even began withdrawing from her studies. Her world had become confined to James's presence, and with each passing day, she felt more disconnected from everything and everyone outside of him. But it wasn't just the isolation that weighed on Ava. It was the guilt and confusion that began to gnaw at her. The deeper the relationship went, the more Ava felt trapped in a cycle she didn't know how to break. James was no longer the man who seemed to understand her loneliness. He was a predator, cleverly disguised as a caring friend. But Ava was too vulnerable to recognize it. She was now dependent on him in ways that she didn't fully comprehend. She had stopped trusting her instincts, believing that his affection was the only form of care she would ever get. Everything came to a head when Ava discovered that she was pregnant. At first, the news was a blur of confusion and fear. She wasn't sure what to do or how to react, but she instinctively turned to James. His response, however, was not one of concern or support. Instead, he told her that they would figure it out together. He insisted that no one needed to know, that they could handle this on their own. James made Ava believe that the pregnancy wasn't a problem, but something they could manage. He reassured her that the two of them were a team and that no one could take that away from them. The more James spoke, the more Ava's sense of reality began to warp. She had no one to turn to. Her mother, who had been too busy with work, had no idea what was happening in her daughter's life. Ava felt completely alone, trapped in a situation she had no control over. She was scared, unsure of what would happen if anyone found out the truth. But she had learned to trust James, even as her instincts screamed at her to run. James continued to manipulate Ava, pushing her deeper into silence. He told her that revealing the pregnancy would ruin everything. He fed her fear, making her believe that no one would believe her story. James knew exactly how to control her, to twist her thoughts into something she could barely recognize as her own. Ava's fear of the outside world grew, and she became more dependent on him than ever before. Things only grew darker when James suggested that Ava's mother would never understand their relationship. He planted seeds of doubt in her mind, telling her that her mother would be furious and that the only way to protect themselves was to keep the pregnancy a secret. James's manipulation intensified. He began making subtle threats, suggesting that if anyone found out, it would be their fault, not his. The more James spoke, the more Ava felt as if she had no choice but to trust him, even though everything inside her screamed that what was happening was wrong. As Ava's mother continued to remain unaware of the growing crisis, the tension between Ava and James built to an unbearable level. Ava was now living in constant fear, not just of the consequences of her actions, but also of the man she had come to rely on for everything. His power over her was absolute, and she was no longer capable of seeing the truth. But the situation was beginning to unravel. The more Ava tried to maintain the illusion of normalcy, the more fragile her reality became. Her world, once small and simple, was now a suffocating prison, and the walls were closing in on her. What she didn't know was that James's dark intentions were far more deadly than she could ever have imagined. And as the weight of the secret grew heavier, so did the danger she was in. The tension in Ava's life was becoming unbearable. Every day felt like a balancing act, maintaining the facade of a normal life while hiding the dark secret that had consumed her. The pregnancy, the manipulation, the isolation. It all began to take a toll on her mental state. She could no longer ignore the growing sense of dread that followed her everywhere she went. Ava's once quiet home was now filled with tension and fear, and the only person she could turn to was James. James had always been the one to keep her calm, to tell her that everything would be okay. But the truth was, everything was falling apart. Ava's mother, busy with her work and unaware of the dangerous relationship unfolding behind her back, started to notice small changes in her daughter's behavior. Ava became more withdrawn, and her grades slipped further. She seemed distant, and when her mother tried to talk to her, Ava would always brush her off, claiming she was just tired or stressed. James, however, was quick to manipulate the situation. He warned Ava that her mother wouldn't understand, and that it would be better if no one found out about their secret. He planted doubt in Ava's mind, convincing her that her mother would never accept their relationship, let alone the pregnancy. He made her believe that the only way to protect herself was to keep quiet and avoid confrontation. His manipulation was so subtle, so convincing, that Ava couldn't see how dangerous it had become. She had become a prisoner in her own life, unable to break free from the hold James had on her. Things took a darker turn one evening when Ava's mother finally confronted James. She had begun to grow suspicious of his influence over Ava, and her instinct as a mother told her that something wasn't right. She could no longer ignore the signs. James, always calm and composed, responded to the confrontation with a coldness that sent a chill down her spine. He assured her that everything was fine, that he was just looking out for Ava, but the more he spoke, the more her suspicions grew. The conversation quickly escalated. Ava's mother demanded to know the truth, and when James became defensive, she realized something was terribly wrong. She didn't know the full extent of their relationship, but she could sense the danger lurking beneath his calm exterior. The argument grew heated, and in a fit of rage, James snapped. In a moment of fury, he attacked, his anger and desperation overtaking him. What had been a subtle manipulation for months now turned into a violent outburst. In a brutal act of violence, he killed Ava's mother. When Ava returned home later that night, she found her mother's lifeless body lying on the floor. Panic and horror swept over her. She had never seen anything like this before. Her heart pounded in her chest as she stood frozen in the doorway, unable to comprehend what had just happened. James, ever the manipulator, was quick to step in. He told Ava that it was an accident, that her mother had fallen, but Ava could see the blood and the carnage. She knew in that moment that James had done it. He had killed her mother to keep his dark secret hidden. Ava, overwhelmed with shock and fear, didn't know what to do. She was terrified of James, terrified of what would happen if she spoke up. His grip on her was now absolute. He had already isolated her from the outside world, and now he had taken the most important person in her life. The fear of retaliation kept her silent, and she allowed herself to believe the twisted lies James had told her. In that moment, she became an accomplice, not in the murder itself, but in the silence that followed. The police were called, but the investigation went nowhere. James, ever the smooth talker, was able to charm his way out of suspicion. He played the part of the concerned neighbor, and to the outside world, nothing seemed amiss. But inside Ava's heart, a storm was raging. She was now living in a nightmare, caught between the love and fear she felt for James, and the crushing guilt of losing her mother. What she didn't realize was that this would only be the beginning of an even darker chain of events that would ultimately spiral into more death and destruction. The aftermath of her mother's death was a blur for Ava. Her grief was suffocated by a sense of helplessness and confusion, emotions she couldn't properly process. James had once again taken control, assuring her that everything would be fine, that she would be safe as long as she stayed by his side. His words, although soothing, felt hollow. The brutal reality of what had happened was settling in, but Ava couldn't find the strength to confront it. She was paralyzed by fear, guilt, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. James told her that she needed to act normal, to avoid suspicion. The police were still investigating, but nothing had pointed back to him. He seemed confident, almost untouchable. He spoke with authority, like a man who knew exactly how to cover his tracks. To Ava, it felt like the whole world was moving around her, while she was stuck in an endless, oppressive fog. She began to question her own thoughts, doubting her instincts, unsure if her feelings of horror were justified, or if they were just the ramblings of a troubled mind. James had expertly planted seeds of doubt within her, and now she questioned everything, even her own memories of the night her mother had died. The days after the incident grew heavier. James became more distant, almost cold, as if the act of murder had become routine for him. But Ava didn't dare question him. Every time she even thought about defying him, a cold shiver ran down her spine. She had learned to avoid crossing his path in those fragile moments when he showed his darker side. The relationship that had once seemed like a lifeline now felt like a prison, one with invisible walls that closed in tighter every day. James's actions became more erratic. He was no longer the charming, charismatic figure he once was. There were moments when Ava saw flashes of the man he had become, a man capable of anything to keep his secret intact. He would stare at her with an intensity that sent chills through her. His touch had lost its warmth, replaced with a cold possessiveness that made Ava uncomfortable. She felt suffocated, yet she couldn't escape. She was too scared to speak out, too terrified to even breathe freely in her own home. The fear of what would happen if she angered him consumed her, leaving her unable to think clearly. James had no intention of letting Ava go. He had already taken so much from her childhood, her mother, her sense of safety, and he wasn't about to let her slip away now. Ava had become his pawn in a game she didn't understand, and he controlled every move she made. He made sure she knew that if she ever tried to speak out, she would be punished. His threats were subtle, but undeniable, whispered in the quiet of the night when they were alone. "You're mine now," he would say, his voice low and cold. "No one will believe you. They'll think it's your fault too." Ava's fear only deepened with every passing day. She began to fear for her own life. The thought that James might one day turn on her completely consumed her, but she was too afraid to leave, too afraid to seek help. The world outside seemed so distant, so unreachable. The police had not made much progress, and she felt isolated, trapped in a nightmare of her own making. Her entire existence had become about survival. She no longer cared for the world around her. Her mind had become consumed by the terror of what might happen next.